Hi there, fellow enthusiasts of the profoundly mundane. Before we plunge into the yawning abyss of medieval guild meeting agendas. Yes, you heard that right. Don't forget to like, subscribe, and hit that notification bell. Trust me, you're going to want to revisit this riveting topic again and again, so you might as well turn on loop while you're at it. See. Welcome to Sleepless Historian, where we dig through the dusty annals of history to find gems of utter monotony that will leave you questioning your life choices. Today, we're embarking on an epic journey into the world of medieval guild meetings. Those glamorous soirees filled with riveting discussions about bylaws, regulations, and the proper way to measure a yard of fabric. Spoiler alert, it was very boring. Picture it, the 14th century, a time of knights, plagues, and the occasional peasant uprising, all while the real action took place behind closed doors in dimly lit taverns and guild halls. Here, the members of various trades, from the most prestigious bakers to the illustrious basket weavers, gathered to discuss matters that would make even the most fervent insomniac nod off. Imagine a group of people passionately debating the ideal width of a ribbon for a ceremonial robe. Or worse, the proper protocol for reprimanding a fellow member who dared to use a less than perfect shade of blue dye. Riveting stuff, right? Ish. As we sift through the stacks of dusty documents, we will unearth the profound intricacies of what it meant to be part of a guild in the Middle Ages. You'll learn about the thrilling hierarchy of masters, journeymen, and apprentices, and the heart-pounding excitement of voting on the new guild motto. Spoiler alert. It was often something incredibly uninspired, like quality first. We'll even delve into the astonishingly nuanced topic of agenda items, which, let me assure you, were all about as exciting as watching paint dry. Because, spoiler alert again, that was probably on the agenda too. So sit back, grab your favorite beverage, preferably something strong to get you through this historical snooze fest, and prepare to relax as we dive deep into the enthralling world of medieval guild meeting agendas. Trust me, this is going to be the most enlightening nap you'll ever take. Now that we're all thoroughly primed for this roller coaster of ennui, let's take a closer look at the astonishingly riveting world of medieval guild inventory procedures. Yes, you heard that right. Inventory procedures. If you thought your last trip to the DMV was a thrilling ride, just wait until we unpack the meticulous cataloging of raw materials in the 14th century. Imagine yourself, if you will, as a member of the esteemed guild of the most dreadfully boring dyers. The meeting begins with a rousing discussion over the guild's inventory of dyes, which, shockingly, are not all created equal. You see, every member must report on their stock of pigments, because nothing says camaraderie like a good old-fashioned recount of the number of pounds of indigo that went missing since last week. Each dyer takes their turn, eyes glazed, recounting their material costs in a monotone voice that would put even the most caffeinated of listeners to sleep. I have 6 pounds of woad, 2 pounds of madder, and I believe I owe the guild 5 shillings for the indigo I borrowed last month. One master dyer would mumble. The only real drama arises when someone raises a hand to address the alarming shortage of yellow dye. Oh, the horror! Which leads to a debate about whether the shortage is due to theft, a poor harvest, or just bad luck. Spoiler alert, it's usually bad luck. Now, if you thought the crafting of fine fabrics was the most exciting part of life in a guild, allow me to shatter that illusion with the bureaucratic rules that governed every aspect of these guild meetings. You see, there were rules about the rules. Yes, that's right. Every guild had its own procedural guide, a weighty tome of tedium known as the Book of Orders, or Statutes of the Guild, which was basically the medieval equivalent of a corporate handbook that few ever read, but everyone pretended to know inside and out. These statutes would outline how many times a member could speak before being cut off. Because nothing says democracy like a good old-fashioned gag order. They also specified how many votes were required to pass an agenda item, which, for the record, was typically around 75% of the guild members present, plus the votes of 2 absent members who somehow didn't get a chance to cast their ballots. Talk about an efficient use of time. And let's not overlook the realm of material costs. Did you know that the pricing of different dyes could be a topic of heated debate? Yes, it's true. Imagine the thrill of a room filled with dyers and weavers openly arguing over the cost of saffron versus turmeric. One might passionately argue, saffron is a premium product, and thus should be priced at twice the amount of turmeric, while another counters with, but turmeric is a staple, and we must remain competitive. The tension could be cut with a dye vat knife. Still, members would often engage in lengthy discussions about how to balance their prices to ensure they wouldn't be outcompeted by the guild of uninspired dyers down the street. This was typically followed by the mandatory market price update segment of the meeting, where they would discuss the latest news from the marketplace, which was about as thrilling as watching grass grow. Yesterday, I saw a vendor selling blue dye for 3 pence a pound. One member would proclaim, only to be met with blank stares. Yeah. Oh. Now, as we meander through the cobwebs of guild bureaucracy, let's take a moment to appreciate the absurdity of guild penalties. Yes, every guild had a list of punitive measures that could be levied against members for the most trivial of infractions. Did you forget to include your name on the minutes of the previous meeting? Prepare to cough up a fine for breach of protocol. Did you accidentally use a slightly off shade of green in your latest fabric design? Congratulations, you've just earned yourself a public reprimand. For the record, these punishments were usually delivered in a manner that made getting a speeding ticket seem like a walk in the park. Imagine being called to the front of the guild hall, the flickering candlelight casting dramatic shadows on the wall as the master dyer announces your transgression to the room. You stand accused of using an unapproved shade of green. How do you plead? Like a scene from a medieval courtroom drama, except with far fewer plot twists and an abundance of yawns. And, of course, we must discuss the Guild's annual inventory audit, an event that was essentially the Super Bowl of tedium. Members would gather to painstakingly count every last spool of thread, sack of dye, and piece of fabric. The excitement was palpable. I count 23 spools of crimson silk, one guild member would declare, while another would respond, I count 24. The room would hold its breath, waiting for the inevitable recount, which could take hours. In the end, it's always the same. One spool goes missing, and everyone stares at the floor, pretending it was never there to begin with. Then we have the thrilling world of guild events. Yes, because even the most tired of guilds felt the need to have some sort of social gathering to break up the monotony. Picture this, an annual banquet held in celebration of their many accomplishments, or lack thereof. Dinners comprised of stale bread, overcooked meat, and a single carrot that somehow made it through the winter. The highlight was usually the toasting of the guild's most recent motto, which, as previously mentioned, was often something breathtakingly uninspired. Here's to quality first, followed by a collective sigh and a return to the less than engaging conversations about the latest dye formulas. Nanom. She. Ow. As the evening drags on, members occasionally attempt to revive interest with tales of their most recent dyeing escapades. Did I ever tell you about the time I dyed my entire batch of wool with woad, only to have it turn out a sickly green? One member might boast. The room erupts in laughter, if you call the sound of a few coughs and a collective laughter. And don't forget about the guild's charitable contributions. Yes, they were known for giving back to the community, but only after a long and arduous debate about how much to donate and what exactly to donate. Shall we donate 5 pounds of our finest blue dye to the local orphanage? Someone might suggest. This would lead to a protracted discussion about the market value of blue dye, the ethics of giving, and whether or not they could afford to part with their precious supplies. Invariably, the result would be that they'd end up donating a basket of old scraps that nobody wanted anyway. So, as we wade through this swamp of bureaucratic minutiae, let's take a moment to appreciate the sheer resilience of these guild members. They endured hour upon hour of discussions about dye shades, material costs, and the importance of proper inventory management, all in the name of craftsmanship, and, if we're honest, a healthy dose of chronic apathy. Oh, as we reach the end of our deep dive into the mind-numbingly boring history of medieval guild meeting agendas, let us tip our hats to the unsung heroes of the guild system, the masters, journeymen, and apprentices who slogged through the minutiae day after day, all for a chance to dye a piece of fabric in the most acceptable shade of blue. Because at the end of the day, what is history if not a collection of the most absurdly tedious moments stitched together by the threads of time? Now, if you'll excuse me, I have a pressing date with my own inventory of utterly boring historical facts. Until next time, keep your shades of blue in check, and remember, mediocre craftsmanship is still craftsmanship. Hi. Now, let's delve deeper into the labyrinthine world of medieval guild meeting agendas, where the most riveting subject was, without a doubt, inventory procedures. Picture this, a dimly lit chamber filled with the aroma of stale bread mixed with a faint whiff of frustration. At the center, guild members sat around a long, splintered table, their eyes glazed over as they waded through the minutiae of inventory management. Inventory! A word that conjures images of endless lists and tedious counting, where the only excitement is the occasional miscount leading to a fierce debate over whether the guild possessed 12 or 13 spools of flaxen thread. Spoiler alert. The answer was usually somewhere in between, but who really cares? The guilds took this task incredibly seriously. After all, a well-managed inventory meant the difference between a thriving workshop and a disastrous fleece shortage. The procedures for maintaining inventory were rigidly codified, as if they were the sacred texts of a forgotten religion. Guild members were required to meticulously record the quantity and quality of every single material. Yes, folks, each piece of wool, cotton, or silk was cataloged with the precision of a tax accountant on the brink of a nervous breakdown. Heaven forbid a member should misplace a single skein of yarn, for the consequences could be dire. Imagine the scandal! The community would whisper for years about the guild that lost track of their precious dyestuffs. And let's not overlook the mind-numbing detail that went into tracking the costs of materials. Not only did guild members have to account for the price of raw materials, but they also had to consider transportation costs, tariffs, and even the emotional toll of haggling with local merchants. The latter was particularly harrowing, as guild members often found themselves embroiled in protracted negotiations over the price of indigo, the most coveted dye of the era. Was it really worth the anguish of enduring a merchant's sly smile while you debated the value of a single ounce of pigment? They seemed to think so. Well, every guild meeting would feature a delightful round of what we can only call The Price is Right, Medieval Edition. Members took turns presenting their findings on current market prices, with lavish details about fluctuations and trends that could make even the most thrilling economic lecture seem like a roller coaster ride. Ladies and gentlemen, a master craftsman would declare, the price of sheep wool has risen by a staggering halfpenny over the last fortnight. Cue the gasps of horror and the subsequent discussions about how to cope with this financial catastrophe. Yes, one halfpenny. a sum so negligible it could easily be lost in the folds of a guild member's robe, could send the entire guild into a tailspin of despair. Next on the agenda was the equally riveting topic of guild bylaws. The rules and regulations that governed every aspect of guild life. Imagine a collection of legalese so dry it could make the Sahara look like a tropical rainforest. These bylaws dictated everything from the acceptable lengths of threads to the precise dimensions of a loom. Every member was expected to be intimately acquainted with these rules, lest they fall prey to the guild's formidable committee of compliance, whose sole purpose seemed to be finding new ways to increase the levels of boredom in the room. The issue of compliance was especially entertaining, as it often led to dramatic showdowns. Picture it, a guild meeting, tensions high as the Committee of Compliance accused a journeyman of using a loom that was an inch wider than permitted. The accused, cheeks flushed with indignation, would rise to his feet, clutching a piece of parchment like it was a life raft in a sea of tedium. I assure you, my loom was not wider than specified in Article 12, Section 4, Subsection B of the Guild Bylaws, he would proclaim, his voice shaking with the weight of his conviction. Yeah, but let's not forget the guild apprentices, who were often the unwitting victims of this bureaucratic circus. Their job was to sit quietly and take notes on these riveting discussions, which usually included the fine points of dyeing techniques and how to properly sharpen a pair of shears. In their minds, they might have envisioned heroic tales of craftsmanship and artistry, but instead found themselves drowning in a sea of regulations. It was a rite of passage, really, a way to prepare them for a lifetime of listening to other people's grievances over thread counts and dyeing processes. As we continue to explore this realm of chronic apathy, we must address the issue of record-keeping. The guilds employed a system so labyrinthine and convoluted that it made deciphering ancient Egyptian hieroglyphs seem like child's play. Every meeting began with the reading of the minutes, an excruciatingly dull recitation of what had transpired in previous meetings. Last week, we discussed the merits of natural versus synthetic dyes. The scribe would drone on, eyes flickering with the desire to escape the room. It was unanimously decided that natural dyes, while preferable, are a terrible nuisance to work with. And so, the cycle continued, with guild members nodding off in unison as they listened to a recitation of the most banal details imaginable. We also allocated funds for the purchase of additional spindles, the scribe would continue, as members jotted down notes that likely contained more doodles than useful information. The sheer absurdity of it all was not lost on anyone, but there they were, trapped in this cycle of administrative tedium, desperately longing for the sweet embrace of an early retirement. Yay. As the meeting trudged on, discussions would inevitably veer into the territory of what-if scenarios. What if we ran out of red dye before the festival? One member would ask, prompting an intense discussion about emergency dye supplies. This could go on for hours, dissecting every possible outcome and contingency, all while the sun set outside, casting a golden hue on a day that had long since become as gray as the fabric they worked with. How? The discussions about festivals were particularly entertaining, as they inevitably led to debates about proper attire. Should all members don the guild's official colors, or should they be allowed to express their individuality? This debate could spark hours of passionate discussion, with members citing historical precedents from previous festivals, and others simply expressing their disdain for the color choices from the previous year. Last year's shade of yellow was far too garish, one member might say, and I'm still recovering from the trauma of seeing our guild paraded around in such a dreadful hue. Adding yet another layer of absurdity, guild meetings often included a segment dedicated to community engagement. This was a euphemism for the tedious outreach efforts that guilds had to undertake to remain relevant in their local towns. Discussions would revolve around organizing workshops, hosting demonstrations, and the ever-frequent bake sale. You could almost hear the collective groan as members tried to brainstorm ideas that would excite the local populace. A task that, frankly, felt like trying to sell ice to penguins. Wah, Nulim, Palingtan. And so, the hours would drag on, filled with details more intricate than the embroidery on a royal gown. The only thing more predictable than the agenda was the exhaustion that accompanied it. When the meeting finally adjourned, members would leave with heads spinning from the weight of decisions about inventory, bill-ors, and festival attire. Yet, there they were, returning week after week, fueled by a sense of duty, and perhaps a touch of masochism. These meetings, filled with discussions about the finest minutiae, were the lifeblood of the guild system. Each agenda item painstakingly crafted to ensure that no thread was left unexamined, no die untested, and no joke left untold. And they did it all for the love of craftsmanship, or at least the love of avoiding actual work for another week. Tcha! So as we close the chapter on this particularly dull historical episode, let us remember the guild members who navigated these meetings with the tenacity of a medieval knight and the spirit of a particularly disinterested tortoise. For in the grand tapestry of history, their legacy is woven from the threads of tedium and the dye of perseverance, all culminating in the brilliant shade of utterly forgettable. As we delve deeper into the riveting world of medieval guild meeting agendas, we must first discuss inventory procedures, an absolutely electrifying topic that could make even the most ardent insomniac roll their eyes. Picture this, a dimly lit room filled with men and women, their eyes glazed over as they gather around a large, creaky table, littered with parchment and quills, each member clutching their inventory ledgers like a lifeline. Now, one must understand that inventory in the medieval guild system wasn't just about counting tools or cloth. No. It was a complex dance of numbers that could make a mathematician weep with envy. Each item had to be recorded meticulously, down to individual bolts of fabric or the last scrap of leather, because nothing screams excitement quite like a detailed account of thread counts. Ooh, nice. The guild's scribe, often a reluctant participant in this saga of dullness, would start the meeting with a thorough reading of the inventory report. We have 24 spools of blue thread, 17 of green, and a staggering 52 of beige, they would announce, their voice dripping with enthusiasm that could rival that of a damp sponge. The response from the room would be a chorus of nods and murmurs as the members wrestled with their own overwhelming apathy. But wait, there's more. The guild members were not just interested in the number of items. They also had to grapple with the costs associated with procuring these materials. This was where the real excitement began. The treasurer, often a man with the charisma of a wet sock, would present the cost analysis. The price of flax has risen by a full penny this quarter, he would declare, his delivery so flat it could be mistaken for a funeral dirge. The guild members would then engage in a riveting debate about whether they could absorb this increase, or if they would need to raise their prices. An existential crisis of sorts for tradespeople who had no idea what profit margin even meant. The discussions often spiraled into deeply philosophical inquiries like, do we really need to raise the price of our tunics? Or can we simply convince our customers that they're getting a superior product? One could almost hear the collective sigh of relief when someone suggested they could simply include a new premium label on their cheap tunics, thereby justifying the increase in price without the actual need to provide better quality. Ingenious, really, as it allowed them to continue to sell subpar garments while patting themselves on the back for their entrepreneurial spirit. And let us not forget the bureaucratic rules that govern these meetings. Yes. The medieval guilds were nothing if not steeped in red tape. Each meeting had a predetermined order of business that would make a parliamentary procedure looked like a raucous rave. The guild members had to adhere to a strict agenda, which was prepared weeks in advance, even though it was often ignored once the meeting commenced. Schönen Dank. The first order of business was usually the reading of the minutes, a riveting recap of the previous meeting read aloud by the scribe. Members would listen attentively, not because they cared about what had transpired previously, but rather to ensure that no personal grievances were aired again. If someone had brought a particularly dry pastry to the last meeting that had caused a minor uproar, it was imperative that it not be repeated. Last week, we discussed the allocation of resources for the upcoming Harvest Festival. It was agreed that we would spend 3 shillings on decorations and 2 on refreshments. The scribe would pause, allowing the information to sink in, though it was clear that no one had a clue what was going on. The next thrilling item on the agenda was the committee reports. Various subcommittees, each one more obscure than the last, would give updates on their activities. For instance, the Committee on Dye Color Standardization would inform the Guild about the latest findings in the world of dyes. We have concluded that the shade of yellow produced from the leaves of the willow tree is not as vibrant as previously thought, they would announce, barely raising the energy in the room. Nay, there was also the Committee for the Preservation of Old Tools, whose findings were so mind-numbing that even the most dedicated tool enthusiast would struggle to stay awake. We recommend keeping the rusty old hammer in storage, as it may serve as a historical artifact in the future. Someone would drone on, while the rest of the guild members would silently contemplate the deeper meaning of life, or at least the meaning of their life. Next meal. Somewhere in the midst of all this, the guild would have to discuss their role in the greater economy, a concept that was as foreign to them as a trip to the moon. Should we engage more with the local market? One brave member might propose, only to be met with blank stares and an awkward silence that could stretch for eons. The thought of venturing outside their familiar confines was so terrifying that it might as well have been a battle with dragons. Way. Then came the pièce de résistance, the proposal for new membership. This thrilling agenda item would have guild members on the edge of their seats, ready to discuss what it meant to welcome someone new into their dull fold. The candidates' qualifications would be debated exhaustively, which often boiled down to whether they had a pulse and could hold a needle without stabbing themselves. Once again, the scribe would read out the qualifications, which invariably included phrases like experience in the field and a general willingness to endure eternal tedium. The guild members would nod solemnly, as though they were deciding the fate of nations rather than whether to allow another soul into their unexciting circle. By this point, the meeting would have dragged on for hours, time measured not in minutes, but in agonizing anecdotes of failed projects and poorly dyed fabrics. A casual observer might wonder why anyone would continue attending, but the truth is that the guild meetings provided a sense of community, even if that community was composed of individuals who preferred monotony over excitement. As the gathering began to wind down, the guild would inevitably turn their attention to the upcoming festivals and events. This would ignite a flicker of life in the room, as members begrudgingly entertained the idea of dressing up in ridiculous costumes to celebrate their craftsmanship. The discussions would revolve around what color sashes to wear, and whether to include a local band of musicians who were only known for being incredibly mediocre. Perhaps we can incorporate a dance or two, someone would suggest, prompting a collective groan, as no one wanted to envision themselves dancing in the town square, like a bunch of awkward peasants. How about we just stick to the traditional parade of tools? Another would counter, their voice dripping with the kind of enthusiasm only found in the depths of despair. Wing now. And just when it seemed that the meeting might come to a close, someone would inevitably raise a hand, asking the age-old question, "What about the pastries for the festival?" The room would erupt into a passionate debate about whether to serve sweet or savory pastries, a topic that could easily overshadow discussions about the rise of inflation or the merits of various shears. Each member would passionately defend their position until, finally, the scribe would declare the meeting adjourned. They would leave, weary but somehow fulfilled, carrying with them the weight of decisions about colors, costs, and confectionaries that would echo in their hearts for days to come. And thus, the guild meetings continued, week after week, a relentless cycle of banality that somehow managed to be both captivating and utterly forgettable. They were the unsung heroes of craftsmanship, the artisans of apathy, navigating the treacherous waters of mediocrity with the grace of a particularly uncoordinated duck. In the grand scheme of history, their legacy remains as unremarkable as the beige fabric they so ardently discussed, preserved in the annals of time as a testament to the endurance of boredom. As the sun rose lazily over the cobblestone streets of medieval towns, another guild meeting was on the horizon, teetering on the precipice of dullness. Picture this, a dimly lit chamber, walls adorned with faded tapestries depicting the guild's finest moments, like the year they unanimously decided on the shade of beige for their uniforms. For those in attendance, the meeting would kick off with the ever-exciting ritual of inventory procedures. Yes, that's right. The thrill of counting bolts of cloth and the heart-racing excitement of measuring lengths of string. The guild members would gather around a long wooden table, their faces lit by the flickering glow of a single tallow candle, casting shadows that danced eerily across their expressions that oscillated between bewilderment and utter indifference. The guild master, a figure as charismatic as a damp rag, would clear his throat, signaling the start of the proceedings. "Today, we will commence with the inventory report," he would announce with a solemnity befitting a coronation. And so it began, with the scribe, a beleaguered soul tasked with recording the minutiae of life, reading off a list of materials that would make even the most dedicated listicle writer yawn. 12 yards of blue fabric, 3 sets of wooden buttons, 11 spools of thread, and a half-empty jar of beeswax. The guild members would nod along, some taking notes, others doodling intricate designs of whatever came to mind, probably more exciting than listening to the scribe's monotone recitation. The debate would inevitably arise over the precise weight of the wool they had on hand. Last month, we recorded a weight of 54 pounds. One member would assert, but I distinctly remember a different figure. It was 55 pounds. This would spark a prolonged discussion, complete with hand gestures and furrowed brows, as they wrestled with the existential crisis of 1 pound of wool. This was the kind of suspense that could be cut with a dull butter knife. As the inventory droned on, discussions would often drift into the murky waters of material costs. The guild members were not just artisans. They were also savvy economists of their modest little realms, meticulously tracking every copper penny spent on their precious supplies. "Prices are rising," one member would lament, clutching a tattered ledger as if it were the Holy Grail. "I remember when a sack of flour cost just 2 pence. Now it's 3. The treasurer, a man whose enthusiasm for numbers rivaled that of a sloth on a particularly lazy day, would respond with a shrug. "Inflation is to be expected," he'd mutter, his eyes glazing over. "It happens." This profound insight would be met with nods of agreement, though the real question, what to do about it, was met with a palpable silence, punctuated only by the sound of a quill scratching against parchment, as the scribe dutifully recorded the corn. Utter lack of action. Then, The guild would shift gears into the labyrinth of bureaucratic rules. Ah, bureaucracy. The backbone of any organization and a surefire way to make even the most riveting topic sound like a lullaby sung by an elderly tortoise. The guild had its own set of regulations, each more mind-numbing than the last. There was, for example, Rule 57B. Any member who fails to attend 3 consecutive meetings must provide a written excuse, notarized by the town clerk, and include a list of any absences they may have had in the prior year. A heated debate could arise about the specific wording of this rule. What constitutes a valid excuse? One member might ask, clearly invested in the matter. Is my cat was sick sufficient? The ensuing discussion would spiral into a philosophical quandary that could rival any Socratic dialogue. After hours of back and forth, it would conclude with a resounding, "We need a committee to discuss this further," effectively postponing any real decision-making yet again. Me, now I need Wasu, we see. And let's not forget the riveting topic of guild dues, a matter that inspired fervent discussions worthy of a Shakespearean play. Every month, members were required to pitch in a sum to keep the guild afloat. How much should we raise the dues? Someone would propose, followed by audible gasps, as if they'd suggested the unthinkable. A new color of fabric. If we raise it by 1 farthing, how will that affect the common man? Another would inquire, gesturing dramatically as if they were defending the realm against invading forces, rather than debating a mere financial adjustment. The guild treasurer would whip out his ledger once more, flipping through pages as though they were the secrets to the universe. If we raise it too much, we might have to reconsider sweet pastries, he'd warn, evoking gasps of horror. The thought of sacrificing pastries for the sake of fiscal responsibility was enough to send chills down the spines of even the most stoic guild member. Then, there would be the crucial discussion of member recruitment. It was essential to keep the guild thriving. After all, what good is an artisan guild without artisans? The conversation would often drift into a debate about the eligibility of new members. Should we allow those who can only weave using synthetic fibers? One member would declare, only to be met with a chorus of disapproval. Synthetic fibers? What are we, savages? Another would retort, crossing their arms in faux outrage. Lulu. Finally, after having navigated the complex and treacherous terrain of dues, recruitment, and the occasional pastry debate, the guild would transition to the pièce de résistance, the minutes from the previous meeting. The scribe would dutifully read aloud the previous meeting's minutes, a riveting account of what they had already discussed. As per our discussion last week, we have agreed on the color beige for our next guild banner. He would drone, and the room would erupt in a cacophony of muted applause, as if he had just recited the latest epic poem. Nah, by saying so. This was the highlight of the meeting, an affirmation of their commitment to the world of craftsmanship and the absolute necessity of beige. Who would dare question their choices? It was as if they were the guardians of an ancient artifact, ensuring that the legacy mediocrity would continue to thrive for generations to come. As the meeting dragged on, the clock would tick slowly, each passing minute stretching into infinity, much like the conversations themselves. Members would occasionally glance at the door, wondering if they could make a break for it without being noticed, but the allure of the agenda kept them rooted in place. They were, after all, committed to the cause, even if that cause was steeped in the most profound shades of tedium. And so, the guild would stumble on, week after week, through discussions about colors, costs, and all manner of bureaucratic nonsense, the very definition of craftsmanship intertwined with chronic apathy. They were the unsung champions of the mundane, the true masters of the art of doing absolutely nothing in the most elaborate manner possible. And as they left the meeting, their minds dulled, but their hearts swelled with the knowledge that they had not only survived another session of soul-sucking contemplation, but had also contributed to the grand tapestry of their guild's legacy, an utterly forgettable saga of beige fabric and indistinguishable pastries. It was. Indeed, history would remember them, if only in passing, as the crafters of ennui, whose contributions to the world of craftsmanship were matched only by their remarkable ability to turn even the most trivial matters into extended debates that could put even the most fervent insomniac to sleep. As the sun cast its sallow glow over the cobbled streets, the guild members, clad in varying degrees of drabness, began to shuffle into the meeting hall, their faces reflecting the sheer excitement of a collective power nap. These were the artisans of the mundane, the purveyors of pointlessness, and they were about to embark on yet another riveting discussion of inventory procedures. Yes, dear viewer, it was time to dive into the exhilarating world of stocktaking, a fine art that was as thrilling as watching paint dry, or perhaps even as captivating as watching the same paint dry on a different wall. Picture this. A long wooden table, scarred with the marks of previous meetings, each scratch a testament to the countless hours spent poring over parchment. The guildmaster, an individual whose charisma could make a rock look animated, would clear his throat with all the panache of a horse preparing for an Olympic event and call the meeting to order. Today, he would announce, voice dripping with enthusiasm that could rival that of a damp sponge, we shall discuss our inventory procedures. Ah, yes. Inventory procedures, the lifeblood of any respectable guild. The guild members nodded as if they were being told the secrets of the universe, rather than the mind-numbing process of counting how many bolts of fabric were sitting in a dusty corner of the storeroom. The guild's ledger would begin to glow ominously, its pages filled with numbers and squiggles that represented not just materials, but also dreams of future projects that would likely never see the light of day. The guild's record keeper, a woman of remarkable patience and an affinity for quill pens, would begin to outline the steps involved in inventory management. Step 1. Assess the inventory room's state of chaos. This involved a thorough examination of the floor, where the remnants of yarn, scraps of leather, and the occasional lost sock conspired to create a scene reminiscent of a post-apocalyptic crafting session. The members grimly jotted down notes, fully aware that this was not just an inventory. It was also an exercise in survival. Step 2. The actual counting. With a precision that could only be described as almost enthusiastic, the guild members would break off into pairs, armed with abacuses and a profound sense of dread. They would wander the storeroom, meticulously counting every spindle of wool, every scrap of silk, and every forgotten piece of equipment from the year of the Great Potato Famine. A year so boring it even made history blush. The counting process was slow, punctuated only by the occasional murmur of confusion as someone discovered they'd been counting the same spool of thread for the third time. Now, let's not forget the joyous task of calculating material costs. Ah, yes, the costs! This was where the guild truly shone. A celebration of numbers, where the only thing more inflated than the prices were the egos of those reporting them. Each member would present their findings, revealing the shocking reality that fabric had, quite shockingly, not become cheaper since last year. Gasps echoed through the hall. Some even clutched their chests in horror, as if they had just learned that the price of bread had gone up. The discussion over material costs would become an exercise in futility, as one member would inevitably suggest employing a more cost-effective fabric. This suggestion would lead to a passionate debate about the merits of using burlap versus the traditional cotton, a topic so thrilling it could make the most ardent historian weep tears of despair. Someone would propose that they consider a third option, perhaps a synthetic blend, an idea that would send shockwaves of horror through the ranks. How could they even contemplate such a sacrilege? The very fabric of their guild was at stake here. Next, we arrive at the pièce de résistance of guild meetings, the bureaucratic rules. Ah, the rules. They were the sacred texts of the guild, written in a language so convoluted that even the most seasoned legal experts would struggle to decipher it. The guild had rules for everything, from the size of the thread to the color of the guild's insignia, which incidentally was a shade of beige so pale it could barely be distinguished from the background of a blank sheet of parchment. Ow! One particularly riveting rule dictated that all fabric must be inspected by the guild's appointed quality control inspector, a position that was both prestigious and utterly devoid of excitement. The inspector, an elderly gentleman with a penchant for spectacles and an impressive collection of musty books, would spend hours examining each piece of fabric, his keen eyes searching for any sign of imperfection. If he found even the slightest flaw, the fabric would be cast aside, doomed to languish in the reject pile. A fate worse than death in the eyes of the guild members, who viewed it as a grim reminder of their own inadequacies. As the meeting meandered on, someone would inevitably raise the topic of guild fundraising. Ah, fundraising. The thrilling endeavor of accumulating enough coin to keep the guild afloat. Ideas would be tossed around like stale bread at a tavern. Bake sales, craft fairs, and even the occasional seance to raise the spirits of long-dead craftsmen who might bless them with inspiration, or at least a decent loaf of bread. Enthusiasm waned as the reality set in. They were artisans, not entrepreneurs, and their last bake sale had resulted in only a single muffin being sold to a bewildered passerby. And right on cue, someone would suggest that the guild should invest in a new sign for their workshop, one that proclaimed their existence to the world in bold, underwhelming letters. This proposal would spark a lengthy debate about the font choice, because, of course, the choice of font could make or break the future of their craftsmanship. Times New Roman. Too common. Comic Sans. Absolutely not. The debate would rage on, and just when it seemed like they had reached a consensus, someone would suggest adding a flourish to the lettering, and chaos would ensue. Aye. As the meeting dwindled on into the late afternoon, with the sun casting long shadows across the hall, the guild members would finally reach the end of their agenda. They would sit in a stupor, wondering how they had survived yet another session of exhausting dialogue that had achieved nothing but the collective realization that they were, in fact, still very much alive. The guildmaster would raise his gavel, tapping it against the table with a finality that echoed through the hall. We shall reconvene next week to discuss the color of the new dye for our sashes. And just like that, another chapter in the annals of guild history would be written, a testament to their ability to turn lifeless bureaucracy into a thriving monument of mediocrity. The members would shuffle out of the meeting hall, their spirits as low as the ceiling, yet they would leave with the faintest glimmer of pride. After all, they had survived the relentless monotony of the guild meeting, and that alone was worthy of a round of applause, if only from the echoing walls that had borne witness to their incredible journey through the labyrinth of regulations, costs, and that most dangerous of all topics, the quality of threat. As the members of the Guild of Mediocre Craftsmen shuffled out of the musty meeting room, clutching their meticulously prepared notes on dye colors and thread quality like trophies of a noble battle won, they entered the realm of the mundane, inventory. Procedures awaited them like a cold bowl of porridge. Inventory procedures, you ask? Oh, yes, dear viewer. Grab your most comfortable chair and prepare for the exhilarating world of counting, categorizing, and cataloging. Each guild member was required, under the watchful eye of the guild master and the ever-disapproving gaze of the guild's treasurer, to maintain an inventory log that could rival the length of a medieval epic. Such logs were not simply lists. They were tomes of tedium that chronicled every piece of linen, every spool of thread, and every ounce of dye that dared to enter their humble workshop. The inventory process was heralded as the pinnacle of administrative excellence, and yet it often devolved into an unfathomable abyss of confusion and dismay. Have we accounted for the 3 spools of indigo that went missing last month? One member would inevitably ask, glancing nervously at the ledger that appeared to be more of a riddle than a record. The treasurer, a stoic figure with a penchant for numbers and a complete lack of humor, would respond, "They are likely in the inventory of the dye subcommittee," as if that committee had somehow transported the spools to the mystical realm of lost crafting. Supplies. The dye subcommittee, dear viewer, was a whole other meeting unto itself. Established in the early 15th century as a response to the growing need for vibrant, yet entirely forgettable, colors in their garments, it had become a veritable black hole of time. Their agendas were often peppered with discussions about the exact hue of mildly exciting blue, which, as you can imagine, stirred the hearts of no one. The subcommittee's leader, an overly enthusiastic artisan named Eldrick, would wax poetic about the emotional resonance of colors, which was absolutely riveting for the first 30 seconds until curiosity gave way to existential dread. And what about the cost of saffron dye? One brave soul ventured to ask during one particularly spirited meeting. Is it still twice the price of the indigo? This question would spark an impassioned debate about the merits of using saffron, a spice far too extravagant for their purposes, versus the cost-effective, yet visually depressing, charcoal gray. A lively exchange of ideas would ensue, primarily revolving around whether charcoal gray could be classified as a color at all. As the treasurer returned to the inventory logs, he would often remind everyone of the guild's stringent regulations surrounding material costs. These regulations, drafted during a particularly uninspiring year known as the Year of the Great Drought of Inspiration, mandated that no more than 15% of the guild's budget could be used for extravagant material. The guild members, in turn, had interpreted extravagance to include anything that cost more than a few pence, a threshold that often left them with nothing but the most worn-out and uninspired supplies. Imagine the discussions we could have over the cost of larks' tongues. Eldrick would muse, half-jokingly, during one of the meetings, only to be met with a collective gasp of horror. Larks' tongues, as rare and coveted as they were in the culinary circles of the nobility, had no place in the inventory of a guild that specialized in woolen garments suitable for peasants. The idea of spending guild funds on such an item was enough to send the treasurer into a fit of apoplexy, clutching his ledger as if it were the Holy Grail itself. Returning to the inventory logs, members would be required to file monthly reports detailing their stock levels, which, more often than not, would result in a catastrophic miscount due to the mysterious disappearing dye phenomenon, a term coined after two. Full barrels of dye simply vanished one fateful week. Theories abounded. Were they stolen by rival guilds, or had they simply evaporated into the ether of the meeting room's stale air? The guild's official stance was that they had been misplaced, but the guild members exchanged knowing glances, having seen more than one barrel roll out of the hold during a particularly chaotic meeting. Once the inventory was finally reconciled, a process that could take days if not weeks, the guild would then turn its attention to the most soul-sucking task of all, the approval of new bylaws. The bylaws. The sacred scrolls of bureaucracy that dictated the minutiae of guild life. It was here that the true essence of medieval guild meetings revealed itself, a labyrinth of red tape so intricate that one could easily lose themselves within its folds. The guild would gather once more, armed with a plethora of proposed amendments, each one more drudgingly boring than the last. Shall we have a motion to approve the amendment regarding the length of sashes? Someone would propose, the words tumbling out of their mouth like a reluctant sigh. The response, a resounding "A," followed by an hour of discussion regarding the proper measurement for said sashes, as if they were fabricating the very robes of a king. The notion of proper length was debated with the fervor typically reserved for wars and revolutions. Should they be measured in inches or thumbs? One member would ask, causing the room to plunge into a heated debate that would have made even the most riveting of parliamentary sessions seem like a thrilling action movie. The room was filled with passionate arguments about the merits of thumbs as a unit of measurement. Was it more relatable to a tradesman with calloused hands? Or were the inches more precise? After what felt like an eternity, the guild members would, by some miracle of divine intervention, arrive at a conclusion that was truly mind-boggling. The sashes shall be measured in thumbs for the greater good of craftsmanship. The room would erupt in a round of applause, if only to distract themselves from the fact that they had spent an entire afternoon discussing the proper length of a garment that would mostly be worn by those who could barely afford it. As the days turned into weeks, the guild would find themselves grappling with yet another pressing matter, the annual Craftsmanship Festival. A gala to showcase their wares to the public. This festival had become an annual tradition, albeit one that left its participants entirely drained of enthusiasm. Planning for the festival was a task that was perpetually left to the last minute, as the guild members vacillated between excitement and absolute dread. Shall we have an exhibit showcasing our finest work? Someone would suggest, their voice tinged with a hint of optimism that quickly plummeted when met with a chorus of apathetic shrugs. The guild would eventually settle on a display of their most uninspired pieces, garments so drab they could only be described as practically invisible against the backdrop of their bleak workshop. And thus, the guild would embark on a quest to refresh their dying creations, a euphemism for, please let's not talk about this for another year. In the weeks leading up to the festival, the guild members would find themselves lost in the depths of despair, struggling to find a single shred of inspiration. Perhaps a booth dedicated to the history of thread? One member would propose, eyes gleaming with fervor as if they had just uncovered the secret to eternal life. This suggestion would earn a few awkward chuckles, followed by a swift reminder that the last educational booth had resulted in an entire afternoon of despair for unsuspecting festival goers. Oh, and die. And so, they would soldier on, pushed to the edge of their collective sanity by the relentless tide of bureaucratic tedium and a profound lack of color in their lives. But within that monotony lay a beauty all its own, a testament to the human spirit's ability to endure even the most excruciatingly dull conversations over inventory procedures and die costs. Yes, dear viewer, the guild's meetings may have inspired yawns, but they were also a reflection of a simpler time, where mastery of the mundane was the highest achievement one could hope for. As they prepared to tackle the next item on the agenda, whether to form a committee to explore the possibilities of a committee to discuss the need for a committee, it became clear mediocrity was their craft, and they were artisans of the absurd. As the guild members sat silently, their eyes glazed over like day-old pastries, the agenda moved swiftly, if by swiftly we mean at the rate of a snail on sedatives, towards the first order of business, inventory procedures. The cherished ritual of counting and recounting every spool of thread, every ounce of dye, every piece of wood. For the medieval craftspeople, nothing was quite as thrilling as the prospect of rifling through stacks of fabric to confirm that, indeed, they had 47 yards of indigo and a suspiciously low number of leather scraps, exactly 10 to be precise. Oh, shall we begin with the linen? Piped up old Gertie, the guild's self-appointed inventory enthusiast, who had taken it upon herself to lead this mind-numbingly meticulous process. With a clipboard that might as well have been a sacred scroll, she began her litany. We have 2 bolts of plain linen, 1 bolt of patterned linen, and 1 questionable bolt of something that may have once been linen, but is now just a relic of a bygone era. The room erupted in murmurs of agreement and slight disdain for the last bolt, which many suspected had been infused with a lingering scent of despair. Despite the general consensus that it should be thrown into the nearest bonfire, the guild had to adhere to their time-honored tradition of, if it could possibly be used, we must hoard it like dragons hoarding gold. Next came the matter of dye costs, a topic so exhilarating it could put a cat to sleep. The guild treasurer, who was known for his ability to turn the simplest of tasks into a multi-hour diatribe, stood up to present his findings. Esteemed colleagues, he began, barely containing his enthusiasm. The current price of wood has increased by precisely 1 farthing since last quarter. This means our margins on blue-dyed fabrics will require a serious reevaluation. Gasps of horror echoed through the room as visions of rising costs danced in their heads like particularly dreary fairies. How will we ever compete with the new dye merchants from the next town over? One particularly anxious apprentice muttered, as though he were already preparing to re-establish his family's legacy of selling mediocre sandals at village fairs. The guild members rallied around the treasurer's report with a projective fervor that could only be inspired by the thought of losing their precious customer base to, heaven forbid, someone who knew how to mix colors properly. Yes, one day, and thus began the lengthy discussion about potential cost-cutting measures. Should they consider a bulk purchase of lesser-known vegetable dyes? Could they perhaps venture into the hazardous realm of synthetic dyes, which were rumored to be all the rage among the young wild artists of Paris? The old-timers shook their heads in horror, fearing they might unintentionally summon the spirit of modernity into their quaint little town. I'll stick to my natural dyes, thank you very much, grumbled one elder, his hair white and frizzy like the unkempt wool of a sheep that had seen too many shearing seasons. Witty. With a heavy heart and a deep sigh that echoed through the hallowed halls of the guild, the conversation moved on to bureaucratic rules. Ah yes, the rules. Those delightful constructs that ensured the guild operated with the efficiency of a broken clock. We must discuss the bylaws regarding the proper procedures for committee formation, droned the secretary, whose monotone voice could lull even the most caffeinated of coffee drinkers into a state of utter resignation. Nay. Bull. Rule number 1. All committee formations must be proposed in writing. This rule had been enacted after an infamous incident involving a spontaneous committee formed to address the concern of a rogue goat that had taken up residence in the guild's storage shed. The goat had somehow been overlooked in the minutes of the last meeting, leading to confusion and a 4-month delay in retrieving the precious inventory buried beneath a mound of hay. Rule number 2. All committee proposals must be seconded. A noble rule indeed, but one that had resulted in endless debates over the semantics of whether a proposal had been duly noted or merely acknowledged. The guild members would often find themselves ensnared in a labyrinth of semantics, utterly convinced that the fate of their entire existence hinged upon the distinction between eyes. That sounds reasonable, and I suppose that could work if we must. Rule number 3. All committees shall present their findings at the next scheduled meeting. This rule had led to the unfortunate creation of the Committee on Committees, which existed solely to address the need for yet more committees. An endless feedback loop of bureaucratic redundancy. It was rumored that this committee had amassed an impressive collection of minutes documenting their discussions, each one a more exhilarating read than the last. One member had actually described a meeting as thrilling, an utter breach of guild etiquette that was met with a scandalized gasp. Marion! Nemo. As the members sat through the excruciating minutiae of the bylaws, they couldn't help but glance at the clock with a mix of dread and despair. Surely they were on the cusp of breaking some sort of record for the most tedious meeting in guild history. There was a certain camaraderie in the shared suffering, as they all exchanged glances that spoke volumes of their collective longing for escape. Preferably to a tavern where the only agenda was to drink ale and share stories of their grand exploits, or at least tales of slightly less dreary inventory counts. But fate would have it that the agenda pressed on. Next up, the proposal for a craftsmanship training session to teach apprentices the fine art of wool carding. This proposal was met with a range of responses, from enthusiastic nods to the kind of eye-rolling that could power a small village. Yea, and say, I believe we should allocate some funds for guest speakers, suggested young Thomas, a bold and slightly misguided apprentice who had clearly underestimated the guild's aversion to anything resembling excitement. Perhaps we could invite someone from that fancy town over yonder. Fancy town. Old, Gertie bellowed, her voice cracking like brittle parchment. You mean the place where they wear colorful garments and dance in the streets? What next? Are we planning a guild parade? I shudder at the thought. This sparked a heated debate about the appropriateness of colorful garments that stretched on for what felt like an eternity. The guild members took turns recounting their harrowing experiences with the neighbors from the fancy town, who had once dared to suggest that their crafting methods might benefit from some creativity. The horror! The idea. Eventually, they settled on a compromise. A training session would be held, but only if it could be conducted entirely within the guild hall, and only if the proposed guest speaker was guaranteed to wear the traditional garb of the guild. Simple, drab, and utterly uninspiring. As the meeting trudged forward, the members found themselves filled with a sense of surreal camaraderie that only comes from enduring such a monumental slog through the mundane. They were bound together by the absurdity of their existence, unified in their commitment to the meticulous details of life in the guild. They had become the artisans of boredom, sculpting the trivial into something monumentally tedious. Well, and as they prepared to tackle the last item on the agenda, the formation of yet another committee to oversee the implementation of the last committee's recommendations, they realized they had reached a pinnacle of absurdity that few had dared to dream. Yes, their lives were a cycle of repetition, but it was this very cycle that lent meaning to their days. After all, in a world where everything was fleeting and chaotic, there was something comfortingly reliable about the sheer banality of their guild meetings. Now, with that thought, they all took a moment to bask in the glow of their collective mediocrity, knowing that tomorrow would bring yet another meeting, and with it, another opportunity to revel in the exquisite dullness of their craft. As the guild members basked in their collective mediocrity, their minds drifted to the next item on the agenda, which was, of course, the ever-thrilling topic of inventory procedures. You see, in the medieval world of craftsmen and artisans, the inventory was not merely a list of materials. It was an epic saga of quantities, measurements, and the existential dread of running out of supplies. It was a journey into the depths of tedium that few had the fortitude to endure. The guild's inventory was managed by an appointed master of count, a position that, despite its grandiose title, came with the thrilling responsibility of tallying every scrap of fabric, every ounce of metal, and every hunk of wood in the workshop. The Master of Count was often seen as a figure of great reverence, though many guild members speculated that the position was more punishing than prestigious. They were greeted with the joy of counting and recounting, only to discover that their fellow guild members had miscalculated the number of nails required for yet another project. A true crisis of biblical proportions. Every Monday, when the sun barely peeked over the horizon and the air was thick with the scent of unspoken ennui, the master of count would gather the guild, and with a voice that could only be described as thrillingly monotone, read from the great ledger of inventory. As of the last meeting, he would begin. We possess a total of 256 wooden dowels, 63 spools of thread, and a grand total of 7.5 yards of black cloth. The half-yard was a contentious topic, as it was a source of endless debate and speculation. Some members swore it was a clerical error. Others believed it was a divine sign meant to spark discussions that would echo through the ages. But the excitement didn't end there. Discussions would follow, not about the materials themselves, but about the nuances of their costs. Oh yes, the costs. The guild members would launch into a thrilling debate over the price of flax versus wool. Do we really need more wool? One would ask, as if pondering the mysteries of the cosmos. What if we could trade it for some fine flax? Flax is all the rage in the neighboring village. And just like that, a heated exchange of ideas would ensue, culminating in a vote that was about as decisive as a squirrel trying to cross a busy street. Whoa. Let us not forget, the guild secretary would interject, the cost of dyes. The saffron has risen in price. Last week, I saw a merchant charging 9 pence for a mere ounce. Gasps would echo through the room as the idea of dye prices reached the peak of their collective horror. 9 pence! The audacity! Perhaps they would have to consider trading in their hand-dyed textiles for something more pedestrian, like beige. As thrilling as the topic of inventory was, it paled in comparison to the next agenda item, the bureaucratic rules governing guild conduct. Ah, the rules! The sacred codex of guild conduct was a hefty tome, bound in what one could only assume was the leather of a particularly bored cow. It contained all the nuances of what was acceptable and what would lead to the dreaded censure, a fate that loomed like a thundercloud over every guild member's head. Rule 27, the secretary would read, states that no member shall create a product using materials not accounted for in the Great Ledger. This rule was designed to maintain order, but it was also a monumental source of anxiety, for there were whispers of a secret guild of rogue artisans who prided themselves on their unaccounted-for creations. They were the rebels of the medieval craftsmanship world, sneaking into the night with their forbidden bolts of fabric and unregistered tools. It was practically a scandal. Then they would discuss Rule 42. All members must wear their guild insignia at all public gatherings. Of course, this would lead to a passionate debate over the design of the insignia itself. It's too bland, one member would insist. It needs more flair. They would spend a good hour debating the merits of gold versus silver thread, only to conclude that they should stick to the original design, which had been crafted during a particularly uninspired meeting 3 decades prior. As the meeting wore on, the topic of material disposal arose, a true gem of bureaucratic absurdity. The guild had a strict procedure for disposing of unusable materials, which involved a ritualistic procession to the waste corner behind the workshop. This was not merely a place to toss scraps, but a sacred ground where unusable materials were laid to rest in an elaborate ceremony that included a reading of the Ballad of the Broken Dowels, a poem of epic proportions that lamented the loss of perfectly good wood due to improper measurements. In a particularly riveting twist, they had recently implemented a proposal to create a waste committee because, of course, the guild needed yet another committee. This committee's sole purpose was to ensure that the waste materials were appropriately categorized. Wood scraps, metal shavings, and useless fabric remnants all had to be meticulously logged. And who could forget the discussion that ensued over whether a torn piece of fabric could be classified as useless if it could still be used to wipe down tools? The debate had been so intense that it had prompted a motion to form a subcommittee to discuss the definition of useless. It was a thrilling time to be alive. Yay. Next on the agenda was the Guild's annual bake sale, a delightful event that doubled as a fundraiser and a way to foster camaraderie among the Guild members. Yet, in true Guild fashion, the planning for this event was an exercise in tedium. "What type of pastries shall we make?" one member would ask, igniting a discussion that would spin into a whirlwind of pastry politics. It was as if the fate of the Guild rested on whether they would offer apple tarts, or perhaps a more daring choice, like spiced gingerbread. "Apple tarts are too predictable," someone would chime in. "We need to stand out." The idea of standing out was, of course, met with much skepticism. But what if they don't sell? What if we have to eat them all ourselves? There was a collective shudder at the thought of being forced to consume hundreds of pastries, a fate worse than death itself. Eeh, I know. As the meeting trudged along, they would inevitably arrive at the topic of member attendance. A dark cloud would loom over the gathering as they discussed the consequences of lateness, a topic that was fraught with tension. "We must be firm," the Guild Master would proclaim, waving a finger with the gravitas of a judge sentencing a criminal. "Lateness will not be tolerated." However, this would lead them down yet another rabbit hole of bureaucracy as they debated how many minutes constituted late. Should it be 5 minutes? 10? Or should they enact a grace period? And thus, another subcommittee was proposed to investigate the issue further, reigniting passions and ensuring that the Guild would forever be embroiled in an endless cycle of meetings about meetings. And so, as the Guild members sat around the table, surrounded by parchment, quills, and the faint smell of boredom, they knew that each meeting was not just a gathering of craftsmen, but a celebration of the mundane. They were the guardians of triviality, keepers of the ledger, and champions of the utterly unremarkable, navigating through the absurdity of their existence with a sense of pride that only comes from a lifetime of doing absolutely nothing of consequence. Tomorrow awaited them with open arms, ready to deliver yet another dose of exquisitely dull discussions, and they were more than ready to embrace it. After all, in the grand tapestry of history, what could possibly be more important than the meticulous minutiae of a guild meeting? As the sun crept over the horizon, casting a mild glow over the guild hall, an architectural marvel that could only be described as a cross between a barn and a poorly designed storage unit, the members prepared for yet another riveting session of the Guild. Slightly enthusiastic craftsmen. Today's agenda bravely announced that they would be tackling the pressing issue of inventory procedures. Yes, inventory procedures. Those painstakingly dull protocols that would make even the most hyperactive squirrel in the forest consider taking a nap. The Guild had decided that the most effective way to manage their supplies, in this case, an assortment of wood shavings, half-finished projects, and, of course, the ever-elusive mysterious velvet that somehow made its way into their inventory, was through a system of meticulous record-keeping. Each member was required to document not just what materials they had on hand, but also the condition of said materials, which ranged from slightly damp to completely unrecognizable. As the meeting commenced, the Guild's treasurer, a man with a mustache that appeared to have been inspired by a particularly ambitious squirrel, stood up to present his findings on the material costs. With the passion of a rock in a field, he droned on about the price fluctuations of wood, which, as any member could attest, were as stable as a one-legged stool. "Last week," he intoned, "oak was 5 pence per foot, but now it has risen to 6 pence. This is a 20% increase." He paused for dramatic effect, waiting for gasps of shock and awe that never came. Instead, his audience shifted uncomfortably, their eyes glazing over as they reconciled the reality that their lives would never be free from the tyranny of oak pricing. Next on the agenda was a debate over the use of recycled materials versus new supplies. The guild had recently discovered that reusing scraps, while environmentally friendly, could also lead to debates that lasted longer than a medieval winter. One particularly enthusiastic member, who had once mistaken a broken chair leg for a revolutionary idea, argued passionately for the cause of upcycling. Imagine, he said, a world where we don't just throw away our leftover bits of wood. We could fashion them into... He trailed off, clearly lost in the vast, infinite ocean of his own imagination. We could fashion them into something great. Silence enveloped the room like a cozy blanket, the kind that makes you want to fall asleep. Following that monumental discussion, the guild moved on to the next thrilling topic, the establishment of a bureaucratic rules subcommittee. Yes, you heard that right. A subcommittee dedicated exclusively to the creation of rules governing the creation of rules. This was, in fact, one of the guild's more avant-garde ideas, which had sparked a movement that many historians now refer to as the Great Circular Bureaucracy of the 14th century. The head of this subcommittee, a woman whose very presence seemed to suck the air out of the room, presented her findings with all the enthusiasm of a damp sponge. We propose a new guideline for our meeting minutes. Instead of summarizing discussions, we should list every item discussed in detail, along with the time each item took. This will allow future generations to understand the depth of our discussions, she said, her eyes glistening with the promise of perpetual dullness. The proposal was met with applause, though it was unclear if the members were clapping for her brilliance or merely trying to wake themselves up. The guild agreed unanimously, of course, because it was the only thing they had been doing for the past century, agreeing on things. The minutes would now contain exhaustive details of their meetings, which would be preserved in an archive that would one day be regarded as a monument to mediocrity. The hour grew late, and the guild members began to feel the effects of their marathon of tedium. They moved on to discuss the annual guild picnic, which had become a highlight of the year, if only for the sheer spectacle of watching craftsmen try to navigate the complexities of outdoor socializing. The event featured an annual competition to see who could bring the most unremarkable dish imaginable. A contest that had, in years past, been dominated by a rather uninspired potato stew. Yummy. Wow. Okay. Surely, one member suggested. We could spice things up this year with something unique. Perhaps a casserole? Gasps echoed around the table as members considered this radical idea. The thought of introducing flavors into their otherwise bland existence was both terrifying and exhilarating. However, after a lengthy debate that spanned a staggering 20 minutes, the guild decided that tradition was paramount, and they would stick with the potato stew. By now, the meeting had devolved into a discussion about what constituted an acceptable potato stew. Was it the type of potatoes used? The seasoning? The method of preparation? Each member took turns sharing their deeply personal potato stew stories, each one more riveting than the last. The guild secretary, who had taken the role of documentarian, scribbled furiously, capturing every unremarkable detail with the urgency of someone who had just stumbled upon a particularly boring archaeological find. Around the table, members began to drift off, visualizing their own ideal potato stews, a creamy concoction that danced on the palate, perhaps, or a hearty mix that could sustain a family through a long winter. Alas, reality would soon seep back in, and they would return to the grim task of discussing the precise thickness of parchment that should be used for official guild communications. As the meeting finally drew to a close, members were invited to share any other business, an opportunity usually filled with the kind of suggestions that would make a statue weep. One member, in a moment of inspired absurdity, suggested they create a boredom awareness day dedicated to exploring the depths of their ennui and perhaps even inviting other guilds to join in. This suggestion was met with a mix of puzzled looks and a smattering of applause, not because it was a good idea, but because it was a new idea, and new ideas, however ridiculous, had a certain charm in the world of the guild. None. How I. And so, as they reluctantly packed their quills and parchment, guild members couldn't help but feel that they had once again achieved something monumental. They had turned a series of mind-numbingly tedious discussions into an afternoon of exquisite monotony. The next meeting was already on the calendar, set to tackle such pressing issues as the guild's official ink color and the correct way to fold a piece of parchment into quarters. Now, tomorrow awaited them, ready to deliver yet another dose of exquisitely dull discussions, and they were more than ready to embrace it. After all, who were they, if not the champions of the utterly unremarkable, custodians of the continuous cycle of paperwork and protocol? In the grand tapestry of history, they would forever be immortalized, not in feats of bravery or innovation, but in the unending saga of crafting the mundane into something that was, perhaps, slightly less than mundane. As the sun rose on another day of endless ennui, the guild members gathered for their next meeting, armed with a sense of duty that could only be compared to a damp towel left in the corner of a musty room. The agenda was, as always, a formidable scroll of unremarkable items, each more tedious than the last. This time, however, the members had outdone themselves by including a special topic that had been the subject of much anticipation and debate: the inventory procedures for the guild's storage of twine. Twine, the unsung hero of the medieval craft world, without which no tapestry could be tied together or basket could be woven. But let us not get ahead of ourselves. First, the guild had to address the pressing issue of how to conduct said inventory. A lively debate ensued over whether to use the count and scribble method or the count, scribble, and panic approach. After several exhausting minutes of discussion, the guild chair, a man known for his unwavering dedication to the boring, declared a vote. True to form, the outcome was a resounding tie. Yet another thrilling twist in the saga of the guild's agenda. With the inventory procedures set to continue indefinitely, the next item on the agenda was even more riveting: the rising costs of raw materials. The guild discussed the fluctuations of sheep wool prices with a fervor that would make a soap opera love triangle look like a mere footnote. Members passionately recounted the days when wool could be acquired for a mere pittance, and how, due to the tragic and unforeseen calamity of sheep grazing too close to the neighbor's prized vegetable garden, prices had skyrocketed. Can you imagine? One member lamented. The sheer audacity of a sheep nibbling on a turnip. The nerve. The room erupted into a chorus of sympathetic gasps and murmurs of agreement, as if they were discussing the most scandalous affair of the century. Details of the increase were painstakingly noted, with calculations so intricate that they rivaled the works of Pythagoras, yet yielded far less excitement. Next on the agenda came the guild's bureaucratic rules, a labyrinthine construct that could leave even the most seasoned civil servant feeling like they had just run a marathon through a foggy haze. The guild had recently discovered a loophole in the bylaws concerning the use of official guild seals on all documents. After several hours of heart-pounding deliberation, they reached a consensus. Every member would have to procure an official guild seal made from a piece of wax that was, ideally, the same color as the guild's preferred ink. The implications of this decision were staggering. Members would now have to visit the local blacksmith who, let's be honest, was probably just as bored as they were. One member raised a hand, a glimmer of hope in his eye. What if we also allowed the use of a sticker? You know, the ones with the shiny foil? The room fell silent, as if someone had suggested they break into a spontaneous waltz. It was quickly decided that while stickers could add an element of pizzazz, they would ultimately detract from the authenticity of the guild's documentation. The motion was squashed faster than a particularly lazy mosquito, and the meeting moved on. In a twist that truly defied the boundaries of tedium, the guild turned its focus to the complexities of ledger keeping. Each craftsperson had to maintain a meticulously detailed record of their output, not just for their own sake, but to ensure that they were adhering to the guild's stringent quality standards. This meant that every single piece of twine, every slice of wood, and every stitch of fabric had to be cataloged with a level of precision that would make even the most ardent accountant weep with joy. Au ist Panish. Nay. The ledger itself was a masterpiece of boredom. Pages upon pages filled with columns and numbers that told the thrilling tale of labor hours spent. The guild members took turns reading aloud their entries, each more thrilling than the last. March 2, 2 hours spent weaving. March 3, 1.5 hours spent untangling twine. The collective sigh of pleasure that followed each entry was palpable, a veritable symphony of sighs in harmony. Yet, what would a guild meeting be without the obligatory discussion of penalties for ledger infractions? The members debated the merits of a fine versus mandatory additional hours of twine weaving. One particularly ambitious member suggested a public shaming system involving the display of the offending ledger in the town square. But this was quickly shot down as even the idea of public humiliation paled in comparison to the prospect of more paperwork. As the hours dragged on, the guild began addressing the very important issue of their guild uniforms. The topic was launched into a whirlwind of discussion about the necessity of capes, hats, and other such accessories, items that frankly had little to no impact on the actual crafting ability of the guild members. Yet here they were, debating whether the shade of blue for the capes should be midnight azure or dusk blue. The stakes had never been higher, and the guild members, with furrowed brows and pens poised, were ready to make history. Or perhaps, more accurately, to make history just a little bit duller. Then came the pièce de résistance, the discussion of the guild's annual potluck. In a thrilling twist, the guild had decided to create an official potluck committee. For the members, this was akin to being appointed to the board of a Fortune 500 company. The discussion of what dishes to include was marked by passionate pleas for the acknowledgement of the twine-crafted meatloaf, a dish so boring that it could inspire a documentary on the art of culinary disappointment. Ian, no katanso. As the meeting reached a fever pitch, the guild chair raised his voice above the din, calling for order. "We must not forget the most crucial rule," he proclaimed. "No dish may exceed the specifications of a 3-ingredient limit. We are craftspeople, not culinary adventurers." The members nodded solemnly, their eyes glazed over with the sheer weight of the decision. After what felt like several lifetimes of back and forth, the meeting was finally drawing to a close. Yet, in a final flourish of bureaucratic magnificence, the guild decided it would be prudent to create a subcommittee dedicated to the evaluation of future agenda items, because, of course, the world desperately needed more layers of inefficiency. And hey... And so, with quills worn down to nubs and parchment, overflowing with the minutiae of their deliberations, the guild members triumphantly adjourned. They walked away, not as heroes or innovators, but as the champions of the painfully dull. Their legacy would be one of tedium so profound that future generations would shake their heads in disbelief, pondering how such a gathering could exist in the annals of history. Tomorrow awaited them, as it always did, with its promise of yet another mind-numbing agenda. But for now, they could take solace in the knowledge that they had, once again, turned the art of crafting into an exercise in bureaucratic absurdity. The world may not know their names, but the twine would remember. Misael Denli. As the guild members dispersed into the cobblestone streets of their quaint little town, one could imagine them contemplating the weighty matters they had just discussed, or perhaps more likely wondering which tavern served the finest ale for dullards in the search of a duller conversation. What awaited them in the next meeting was bound to be as thrilling as watching paint dry on a damp day. But before we delve into the riveting world of inventory procedures and material costs, let us take a moment to appreciate the sheer artistry with which these guilds approach the minutiae of their craft. Now, first and foremost, we must not overlook the riveting process of inventory management, which, contrary to what some may assume, did not simply involve counting sheep-like quantities of twine or nails. Oh no, this was a finely tuned ritual involving a plethora of procedures and protocols that would make even the sturdiest of hearts tremble with excitement. Picture this. A room filled with dusty ledgers, the smell of ancient ink wafting through the air like a fine wine that has gone sour, and a handful of guild members huddled around a table strewn with various bits of parchment containing far too many numbers. Et moi, que sais il? The inventory would begin with a painstaking count of every single item. This meant that each guild member had to spend an excruciating afternoon cataloging everything from the most mundane pieces of wood to the rarest of bespoke tools, an exercise so monotonous that it could only be likened to watching grass grow. And let us not forget the inclusion of mysterious items, a term that struck fear into the hearts of guildsmen, as they would often lead to hours of debate about what might have been left over from previous projects. Perhaps the remains of an ill-fated goblin, or the remnants of a very unfortunate wooden horse. Next came the material costs, a topic that would send any ordinary person into a state of perpetual yawning. The guild took this very seriously, of course, because nothing says craftsmanship quite like meticulously calculating the cost of a single piece of twine. Each member was tasked with compiling a report on the price of materials acquired from various local merchants, who, because life can be cruel, often haggled over the prices with the fervor of a gladiator in the Colosseum. With each price written down, members would debate the merits of one merchant over another, often citing their previous experiences, such as the time Old Man Thistlewick charged them an exorbitant fee for a batch of inferior quality nails. The minutes of these discussions would read like epic poetry, filled with tales of woe and despair, regarding the trials of negotiating for quality lumber. Shay. Once the costs were established, the guild would transition into an equally thrilling phase, the discussion of budget allocation. Yes, there were budgets. Each guild was allotted a specific sum of money for the year, which had to be allocated with the precision of a surgeon performing a delicate operation. Members would gather, clutching their calculators, those ancient relics of the time, like they were the Holy Grail, and engage in fervent discussions about whether to spend more on better quality tools or to save for the annual guild feast, which was less a annual guild feast. Celebration of craftsmanship, and more a contest to see who could consume the most ale without falling off their stool. With every item discussed, the guild members would record their findings in what they affectionately called the Book of Financial Sorrows. Here, every expense, every allocation, and every miscalculation was documented, ensuring that future generations could experience the sheer joy of reliving the budgetary nightmares of their forebears. They would even take time to debate the merits of different writing implements, because naturally, the kind of quill used could influence the overall aesthetic of the book. After all, what's the point of meticulous accounting if it isn't pleasing to the eye? But we must not forget the bureaucratic rules that governed every aspect of their meetings. With the seriousness of a Roman senator, the guild members adhered to a strict code of conduct. This included an elaborate procedure for speaking. Each person was only allowed to speak after raising their hand, a practice that, while noble in its intent to promote order, quickly devolved into a circus of waving arms and frustrated sighs. Those who dared to interrupt would often be met with the archaic punishment of being compelled to recite the guild's entire mission statement, a dense and convoluted paragraph that had been amended more times than anyone cared to count. Yeah, sure. Then there were the procedural motions, which were so frequent and tedious they could induce sleep with the mere mention of them. I motioned to approve the minutes from last week's meeting. Would be followed by a second, a discussion of whether the minutes should include the riveting detail of who had brought the stale biscuits. And then finally, after an eternity of back and forth, what? The outcome? Almost always unanimous. It seemed that the only thing more certain than the rising sun was that these minutes would be approved with the fervor of 100 battle cries. The guild's approach to problem-solving was equally thrilling. Whenever a conflict arose, such as someone forgetting to bring the ale to the last meeting, members would engage in a lengthy resolution process. This involved composing a letter to the offending party, detailing their transgressions, and then drafting a response that would be read aloud at the next meeting. The whole affair was a perfect blend of passive-aggressive politeness and medieval drama. Because who wouldn't want to spend an evening discussing a fellow member's failure to provide refreshments? As the hours wore on, the guild members would occasionally drift into daydreams, imagining themselves as knights of yore, valiantly fighting for the right to produce the finest craftsmanship in the realm. Yet, the harsh reality of the gathering would snap them back to their seats faster than a bell, tolling for the end of a workday. The next agenda item would always pull them back into the abyss of tedium, the ever-important discussion on the proper storage of tools. With the fervor of a philosopher pondering the mysteries of existence, they would debate whether the tools were best kept in chests or hung on walls. Each option presented with a deep dive into the merits and drawbacks of wood versus iron in tool storage. One particularly zealous member might argue passionately about the virtues of air circulation, while another would insist that the preservation of tools was paramount, lest they fall victim to the dreaded rust. And then there was the topic of apprenticeships, a matter that would ignite the room with a fervor typically reserved for debates on the monarchy. The guild had established a very detailed set of rules regarding the training of apprentices, rules so convoluted and labyrinthine that one needed a map and a guiding light to navigate them. Discussions would revolve around the number of hours an apprentice should spend on menial tasks versus the sacred art of craftsmanship itself. The minutes recorded this ongoing debate with all the excitement of watching a snail race. The guild members, in all their bureaucratic glory, would find solace in this exercise, for it provided them with a sense of purpose in their otherwise drab lives. They may not have been creating world-changing innovations or crafting masterpieces that would echo through time, but they were undoubtedly the unsung heroes of mediocrity, standing firmly against the tides of excitement and progress. And as they left every meeting, the promise of yet another agenda loomed on the horizon. A beacon of boredom shining ever so brightly in their dreary lives, reminding them that they were, indeed, the keepers of tedium. Tomorrow would bring a new set of challenges, new motions to be seconded, and new debates about the most efficient way to drill a hole into a piece of wood. But for now, they could return to their homes, clutching their parchment and quills, stars in the eyes of the utterly and profoundly mundane, ready to write the next chapter in the ever-illustrious saga of medieval guild meeting agendas. As the sun dipped below the horizon, casting a warm, dull glow over the cobbled streets of medieval towns, the guild members shuffled back to their respective workshops, their heads filled with thoughts of the most riveting topics discussed that evening. Such excitement! One can hardly contain oneself when thinking about the thrilling procedural intricacies surrounding inventory management. Yes, dear viewers, We are about to take a deep plunge into the mundane abyss of how guilds meticulously catalog their materials and the excruciatingly detailed processes involved. Imagine, if you will, a dimly lit room, laden with the scent of damp parchment and the unmistakable musk of unwashed wool. Here, amidst the cobwebs and the occasional scuttling rat, the guild's inventory clerk would sit at a rickety wooden table, quill in hand, ready to embark on the harrowing task of inventory reconciliation. Every single item had to be accounted for, from the finest silk threads to the most humble scraps of wood, all recorded in a ledger that would make even the most ardent spreadsheet enthusiast weep with joy. Nay, each item categorized with an almost religious fervor: looms, hammers, and the ever-elusive miscellaneous supplies, which were typically just a collection of broken tools and leftover pieces from previous projects. A guild member might rise during a meeting, brimming with enthusiasm to suggest a new line item for excess sawdust. The air would thrum with anticipation as the others leaned in, hearts racing, to hear the fate of that proposal. Would it pass? Would it be shelved for discussion at the next meeting? The tension was palpable. Next came the delightful dance of material costs, a riveting topic that surely sparked the flames of passion for anyone within earshot. The treasurer, a figure often adorned with the weight of the guild's collective financial woes, would present a budget that detailed every last farthing spent on raw materials. Ladies and gentlemen, esteemed members of the guild, he would begin, his voice a mixture of pride and despair. Today, we must address the rising costs of sheep shearing. Gasps would echo around the room. Sheep shearing. What a scandalous topic to tackle. Bang! With charts painstakingly sketched out on parchment, the treasurer would reveal the shocking price fluctuations of wool. How one particularly bad year for sheep, who apparently had a penchant for spontaneous herd migrations, had driven the costs through the roof. God. The guild members would nod solemnly, fully aware that their own livelihoods hinged on the success of these woolly creatures. Debates would ensue about whether to invest in new shearing equipment or simply stick with the tried-and-true rusty shears that had been passed down through generations, an agonizing choice between efficiency and nostalgia. And then, just when you thought the excitement couldn't possibly reach greater heights, we'd delve into the bureaucratic rules governing guild operations, those ever-pertinent regulations that dictated everything from the type of dye to be used in fabric, to the exact measurement of a loaf of bread, because, of course, bread was a craft and not merely sustenance. The guild's bylaws were a veritable tome of tedium, each page packed with the minutiae of medieval business. The prospect of amending a bylaw was akin to throwing a gala. The anticipation of the vote could ignite passions that rivaled those of courtly love. One particularly riveting bylaw stated that guild members were not allowed to use more than 10 drops of indigo dye for a single bolt of fabric. "We must maintain standards," the guildmaster would exclaim as he pounded the table, sending a few stray quills flying. "We cannot have our colors running afoul of the established norms." And the members, many of whom had not seen excitement since the last horse race, would nod vigorously in agreement, as if they were defending their very honor. Now, let us not forget the thrilling subject of apprenticeship agreements, a cornerstone of guild operations, and a topic steeped in an alarming amount of paperwork. When a fresh-faced apprentice, wide-eyed and eager, was accepted into the guild, it kicked off a circus of ink and legal jargon that would leave even the most seasoned bureaucrats sweating in confusion. Contracts were drafted, specifying the duration of the apprenticeship, usually 7 grueling years, the required skills to be mastered, which included everything from honing the craft of sewing seams to the fine art of avoiding injury while wielding sharp tools, and perhaps most importantly, the precise number of hours the apprentice would be expected to serve each day. Oh, but the fun didn't stop there. After the contracts were signed, each apprentice was assigned a master, whose job was to ensure that the apprentice did not, in fact, fall asleep while weaving or mistakenly set fire to the workshop. The guild's minutes would then record every infraction, every late arrival, and every instance of unauthorized use of the master's tools, leading to hours of tense deliberation at subsequent meetings. The fear of being the subject of such discussions would send shivers down the spines of even the most seasoned craftsmen. Whoa! As the calendar turned, it marked not just the passing of time, but the inevitable approach of annual assessments, those delightful occasions when the guild would gather to review the performance of its members. Picture this: a grand hall filled with craftsmen, all clad in their finest, most drab attire, presenting their wares for inspection. The atmosphere crackled with anticipation as each guild member stood before the others, nervously clutching their most mediocre creations. "Behold," one might cry, revealing a shirt that was slightly askew, "my latest masterpiece." The ensuing critique would be as exhilarating as watching paint dry. Every seam was examined, every stitch scrutinized, and the inevitable sarcastic remarks would fly through the air. "A remarkable effort, truly, but I see you've made a bold choice in fabric texture. It's quite raw." The laughter would echo through the hall, a cacophony of camaraderie that almost made the tedium worth it. Tea? And then, just when you thought you had reached the pinnacle of boredom, let us wade through the shallow waters of guild fundraising initiatives. Ah, yes, the joy of organizing a festive market, an event that would be the highlight of the guild calendar, if one could overlook the fact that it involved endless planning sessions, endless disagreements over booth placements, and a tireless debate on booth placements, and a tireless debate whether to serve apple pie or meat pies at the event. "We must cater to our clientele," they'd argue, while the rest of the town simply hoped for some semblance of entertainment. Oh, Hyundai, I'm saying. In the weeks leading up to the market, guild members would gather regularly to discuss the minutiae of logistics, how many tables were needed, what time to set up, and of course, the most crucial question of all, who would be responsible for cleaning up the mess afterward? The answer, as it often was, would be buried deep within the pages of the agenda, and likely forgotten until the last moment, when every member would look around and think, surely someone else will volunteer. As the days turned into years, the guild continued its grind, a perpetual wheel of paperwork and monotony. But within that drudgery lay a peculiar kind of beauty, a tapestry of human effort stitched together by the very threads of boredom. Each agenda item, every motion seconded, and each debate over wool prices was a testament to a life led in pursuit of the painfully predictable, a ritualistic dance of mediocrity that, strangely, bound these craftsmen together. In the end, the guild meetings were not merely gatherings of craftsmen. They were celebrations of the utterly uneventful, a legacy of diligent boredom that would echo through the ages, reminding us all that sometimes the most riveting tales are hidden beneath layers of dull meetings and mundane agendas, waiting patiently to be unearthed. And as the final quill was set down, and the last agenda item was ticked off, these guild members would walk into the night, ready to embrace yet another day of the beautifully banal. Indiscerti, nafana, endito, ediseneneli, endechiuzel, wawina resa, senere. As the sun dipped below the horizon, casting a soft glow over the cobblestone streets, the guild members would shuffle back to their respective workshops, clutching their meticulously detailed meeting minutes. These documents, often referred to in hushed tones as the Chronicles of Tedium, were the sacred texts of the guild. Each page contained an excruciatingly thorough account of the proceedings, with every comma and semicolon carefully placed, much like the guild members themselves, rigid and predictably precise. Oh, the first item on every agenda was invariably the inventory report. Ah, yes, the inventory report. A thrilling spectacle where numbers danced across the page with the grace of a lead-footed bear. Each guild member would take turns reporting on the materials they had on hand, which was always a riveting affair. I have 12 spools of indigo thread, 7 sheaves of flax, and a bewildering assortment of dye remnants from last year's mauve crisis. The room would erupt in what can only be described as a cacophony of indifferent nods and half-hearted yawns, each response more tepid than the last. But it wasn't just about the numbers. Oh no, my dear viewers, it was also about the costs. The guild's treasurer, who wore the weight of fiscal responsibility like a cloak of lead, would then rise to deliver the dreaded material costs report. This report was a mind-numbing enumeration of prices that fluctuated with the thrilling volatility of market supply. Think of it as the medieval version of watching paint dry, but with an added layer of economic despair. The price of wool has risen by 3 pence since last week. Yes, 3 pence. Can you fathom the horror? The audience would respond with polite gasps, though no one truly cared. By the end of the report, members would leave the room wondering if they could afford a loaf of bread, assuming they could stay awake long enough to remember what they were talking about. Then, we delve into the labyrinthine world of procurement procedures. Ah, procurement. The art of purchasing goods in a manner so tedious, it could put even the most ardent insomniac to sleep. Every guild had its own set of rules, a veritable codex of procurement, detailing the appropriate channels through which one must navigate to acquire materials. There were forms to fill out, approvals to seek, and, most delightful of all, waiting periods that could stretch on for weeks. You need to submit the request for materials form to the chief scribe, who will then pass it on to the overseer of supplies, who will, in turn, consult the guildmaster during the next full moon. Yes, you heard that right. The full moon. Because why make anything easy when you can inject a dash of celestial drama into the mix? In the midst of this bureaucratic ballet, the members would occasionally engage in thrilling discussions about the virtues of various suppliers. I must say, the burlap from Old Man Hargrove has gone downhill since last summer. Have you felt the texture? It's like sandpaper now. Gasps of horror would ripple through the crowd, and members would jot down notes as if Hargrove's burlap was a matter of life and death. Spoiler alert, it was not. Alien? Next came the pièce de résistance of the guild meeting, the endless debate over quality control standards. This segment would often feel like an eternity spent in a purgatory of pedantry. I propose we establish a new committee, the Committee of Thread Thickness Evaluation, one brave soul might suggest. We need to ensure that all yarn meets the minimum standard of 0.85 millimeters in diameter. The room would erupt into a frenzy of fervent agreement, as if the fate of the universe hinged on the diameter of a strand of yarn. The committee would be formed, and thus began the slow march towards a future where thread thickness was guaranteed to be as uniform as the guild members' expressions of solemnity. As the meeting trudged on, discussions would meander into the perilous territory of labor disputes. The guild had its fair share of internal squabbles, usually revolving around who was entitled to what share of the profits. I put in 50 hours last week, and all I got was this measly trinket, one member would exclaim, brandishing a particularly unspectacular wooden spoon like a trophy of injustice. If only we had a clear profit-sharing system, another would chime in, leading to a round of nods and murmurs that echoed through the hall like the rustling of dry leaves. The guild members would eventually settle on a new profit-sharing formula that was so complicated, even the most astute mathematicians of the era would have thrown their hands up in despair. But what's a guild meeting without the occasional foray into the realm of social events? Yes, dear viewers, every guild had its social calendar, a schedule so meticulously planned it rivaled the logistics of a royal wedding. "We must discuss the annual craft fair," someone would declare, and the room would light up with the kind of enthusiasm reserved for the sighting of a rare bird. Plans would be drawn up for booths, displays, and, heaven forbid, a competition for the best handcrafted item. The stakes were high, and the thrill of competition would drive members to a frenzy of creativity, resulting in such masterpieces as The inexplicably large wooden spoon and the chair that nearly killed someone. Of course, all this excitement would eventually lead to the inevitable outcome, the budget allocation discussion. Ah, yes, the budget allocation, where dreams of grandeur met the stark reality of limited resources. Each committee would present its requests, only to have the treasurer shoot them down with all the enthusiasm of a wet blanket. "You want how much for a new spinning wheel?" "I'm sorry, but we're currently operating under a deficit of 2 pence. The meeting would often devolve into a quagmire of despair, as members realized they would have to continue using their old rickety tools for yet another year. Finally, as the evening wore on, the last item on the agenda would glide into view like a long-lost friend. Any other business? This was the moment members had been waiting for, a chance to air grievances that had been festering since the last meeting. "I have a bone to pick with our guild's mascot," one disgruntled member would announce. "Why do we have a poorly painted goat on the banner? We are craftsmen, not animal husbandry enthusiasts." The room would erupt in laughter, and for a brief moment, the specter of boredom would be banished, only to return with a vengeance as the meeting drew to a close. With a final flourish, the guildmaster would call the meeting to a close, a gesture so anticlimactic it could only be described as a symphony of sighs. "Let us reconvene next fortnight, where we shall dive even deeper into the murky waters of our collective inertia." With that, the members would rise, stretch their weary limbs, and shuffle out of the hall, leaving behind a lingering air of lethargy that could only be rivaled by the stillness of a forgotten graveyard. And as they stepped into the cool night air, one could almost envision a world outside their guild. A world vibrant with color and chaos, where excitement lurked behind every corner. Yet here they were, comfortably ensconced in their lives of exquisite dullness, forever entwined in the tapestry of medieval craftsmanship and chronic apathy. And there you have it, folks. We've plummeted headfirst into the tedium of medieval guild meeting agendas, where groundbreaking decisions like shall we continue using sheep's wool or transition to goat hair were debated with all the fervor of watching paint dry. Who knew that the fate of fine craftsmanship could hinge on the riveting topic of whether to hold a bake sale or simply order more ale? It's like the Super Bowl of monotony, where every play is a pause for yawning. But fear not, for in this seemingly endless cycle of chronic apathy, we find a treasure trove of absurdity. Because nothing says thrilling quite like a 12-point agenda detailing the proper lengths of shoelaces in the Cobbler's Guild. Well, if you enjoyed this exhilarating ride through the sleepy back alleys of history, make sure to like, subscribe, and drop a comment about your favorite dull moment. And don't forget to turn on loop, because who wouldn't want to relive this experience over and over again? Happy napping!